A very good morning to you. This is the South African Morning. Now, startling statistics are that over 1 million people lose their lives due to road accidents. And it's also estimated that 69 million individuals worldwide sustain traumatic brain injury each year. Now, here at home, October is National Transport Month, and the African Brain Child Initiative, which leads in research into traumatic brain injury in children, will be launching an awareness campaign. Now, this is with the aim of highlighting the serious implications of, as well as the dangers of children not wearing a safety belt. Now, joining us this morning is head of the Pediatric Neurosurgery Unit at UCT and is also director at the African Brain Child, Professor Tony Figaji. Good to have you with us this morning, Professor. Now, when we talk about children wearing seat belts, oftentimes, as adults, you'll get into the car and instinctively you'll put your seatbelt on. That is, of course, if you are a law-abiding citizen. But how often do you find that parents ensure that the children who are sitting at the back also have their seatbelts on?
Well, personally, it's shocking that when you pay attention on the road, when you pull up next to somebody at the traffic light or you're driving behind them, you'd be surprised how often children aren't wearing seatbelt and they're just bouncing around in the back seat. When you actually look at the figures of it, it's in keeping with that. So there was a study at Red Cross a few years back where we looked at just the cars that were coming in and out of the hospital. And so one would think that you're coming to a major pediatric hospital, the awareness about safety, and there's child safe as well, the awareness of safety should be very high. And 90% of kids weren't wearing seatbelts. And that was at a pediatric hospital. And when we look at our trauma statistics of the kids who were involved in a motor vehicle accident as a passenger, only 4% of them, 4% of children were wearing a seatbelt at the time.
According to the research that has been done in the statistics here, it says that traumatic brain injury is actually behind the cause of death in children, even more than cancer. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we live in a world where preventable injury is very, very common. And of the severe causes of injury, and there are many causes, children fall. For example, children get involved in homicides even. But the leading cause, above all, across the world is road traffic accidents. And it's a completely preventable cause of death. And over the age of around 1 or 2, the leading cause of death of children, older children, is injury. And of those injury causes, road traffic accidents are right up at the top.
So, Professor, there is a little bit of a challenge here, because seat belts are actually designed for adults. And even if you are an adult, the jurisdiction is that you need to be at least 1.5 meters tall in order to wear a seat belt. How do you circumvent this then as a parent for children?
Well, it's not easy in a low and middle income country. I think most people would agree that South Africa, being an upper middle income country and one of the relatively organized societies across the breadth of Africa, should be doing much better. And even a lap seatbelt, or a seatbelt that has a 3-point harness but is not being held over the child's chest, is better than nothing. So even if you just have a lap belt seatbelt, in most cars, if they're roadworthy, are equipped with a seatbelt. So that shouldn't be an excuse. Of course, the ideal is that children are in car seats, and car seats that are appropriate for the age. So type of car seat available, at least that is most appropriate for a very young child, will be different from a 4 to 5-year-old child or an 8 to 9-year-old child. Now that, of course, is economically a much greater challenge for us as a society. And there are absolutely initiatives to try to increase the access to car seats for economically underprivileged communities that can't afford car seats. So there are initiatives to do that. But not having a car seat is not an excuse for not having at least a lap belt on.
Is there not a likelihood, Professor, that the child could actually get injured even within the seatbelt because it's perhaps too tight for them or it doesn't fit them properly? And so should there be a sudden jerking action, from the car having to maybe apply the brakes, that the child could actually even get injured because they're in the seatbelt?
Absolutely, but the risk is always much less with a seatbelt than without a seatbelt. So it's not to say that a child who is strapped in is not at risk at all or could not have a seatbelt injury, but that risk is so much lower than if the child is not restrained. If a car comes to a sudden halt, or even worse, if a car topples, the child acts like a projectile. And very often we are in a situation where a car rolls or a car just comes to a sudden stop. The child is not restrained. The child acts as a projectile and is ejected from the car, which obviously exposes the child to a much more severe type of injury.
So as you're saying, it's better safe than sorry, better some precaution than no precaution at all. Now, we know kids sitting in the back seat of the car, they tend to be very fidgety, and even if you have restrained them with the seatbelt, if you don't check on them periodically, that seatbelt is going to be off. How would you say parents need to train their children to actually keep those seatbelts on for their own good?
Well, I think it's a combination of several things. It's the combination that we have as individual parents or caregivers of children, aunts and uncles. And it is the responsibility of us as a society to create awareness so that certain things become automatic. And in the younger generation of children, they are much more used to the idea of putting in a seatbelt than the previous generation was. It's one of those things that we just have to be motivated for. And we can be motivated for it as individuals and as a society, because it's not that difficult. And the recent pandemic is a good example of how we can mobilize ourselves as a society for a pandemic. And as you know, almost overnight, we completely changed our society. We weren't going into work. We couldn't go into a hospital to visit sick relatives. We couldn't go out on the beach. There's so many things that our society just mobilizes instantly in the understanding that we could prevent deaths. For some reason, at a much lower level of interventions, a simple seatbelt, for example, somehow we still aren't crossing that threshold of realizing that there are simple things that we can do as a society that can prevent deaths that are currently on the scale of a pandemic.
We'll leave it at that for this morning, Professor Anthony Figaji. Thank you so much for that insight. I think, it gives you food for thought. Maybe it's not something that you think of every single day, but it's definitely something that can be a life changer for you if your child is not strapped up at the back of a car seat. And as the professor says, yes, there may be financial limitations, but if you can't get a car seat for your child, at least make sure that they are strapped. And this conversation we bring you in Transport Month, which is what we are marking in South Africa, as well as World Trauma Day, which is on this day. That's Professor Anthony Figaji, Director at African Brainchild.
Now to international news, and US President Joe Biden